What if the oldest stories in human history aren't locked away in ancient temples or buried in forgotten tombs? What if they're hidden in the stars above your head right now, whispered through tens of thousands of years by people who never learned to write? Scientists just discovered that some myths might be over 100,000 years old. But here's what'll blow your mind. We can't prove which one came first, and the answer might change everything we think we know about human consciousness itself. Everyone wants to know which mythology is the oldest: Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek? But here's the problem that keeps archaeologists awake at night. We're asking the wrong question. The oldest written mythology and the actual oldest mythology are two completely different things. Writing was only invented 5,000 years ago, but humans have been telling stories for potentially 100,000 years or more. That means there's a massive gap, an invisible ocean of lost myths that existed long before anyone could write them down. Today, we're diving into the greatest detective story in human history, hunting for myths so ancient they might predate civilization itself. Why we can't name the oldest mythology. Before we start this journey, you need to understand why this mystery is so brutally difficult to solve. Mythology lives in spoken words, in songs, in rituals performed around fires, and spoken words disappear the moment they're said. They leave no bones, no pottery shards, no ruins to excavate. When archaeologists dig up ancient cities, they find incredible things: weapons, jewelry, buildings. But stories? Stories are ghosts. They only survive if someone writes them down or keeps telling them generation after generation without changing them. And humans are terrible at that. Every time a story gets retold, it shifts a little. Mesopotamia, where writing began. If you want the oldest mythology we can actually read, you have to travel to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. This is where writing was born around 3200 BCE, invented by the Sumerians to keep track of grain and taxes. But once humans learned to write, they didn't just record business transactions. They wrote down their stories. And the stories they wrote were already ancient when they reached clay tablets. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE. It tells the story of a king who sought immortality and failed, learning that death comes for everyone, even heroes. But here's the key detail. This epic wasn't original. It was compiled from much older Sumerian poems and stories that had been passed down orally for centuries, maybe millennia. Even more ancient is the Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BCE, which tells the Mesopotamian creation epic story and includes a great flood, remarkably similar to the biblical flood in Noah's Ark. But again, the written version came long after the oral tradition began. Mesopotamian mythology gives us our oldest readable stories, but even these texts point backward to something older, something that existed before writing, floating in the oral traditions of prehistoric peoples. Egypt, the pyramid texts. While Mesopotamia was writing epic poetry, ancient Egypt was carving religious texts into the walls of pyramids. The pyramid texts, dating to around 2400 to 2300 BCE, are some of the oldest religious writings ever discovered. These aren't stories in the traditional sense. They're spells, prayers, and rituals designed to help the dead pharaoh ascend to the afterlife and join the gods. But embedded within them are fragments of Egyptian mythology, references to Osiris, the god who died and was resurrected, mentions of Ra, the sun god who travels through the underworld each. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime, 65,000 years of stories. Now we enter truly mind-bending territory. What if there are mythologies that have been continuously told for tens of thousands of years, passed from generation to generation, never written down, but somehow surviving intact? Aboriginal Australian mythology might be exactly that. Aboriginal Australians have lived on their continent for at least 65,000 years, making them the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Their mythology, known as the Dreamtime, describes how ancestral spirits created the world, shaped the landscape, and established the laws that govern existence. Here's where it gets incredible. Some Dreamtime stories appear to describe real geological events. Stories about the sea rising and flooding coastal areas match what actually happened at the end of the last ice age. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the stories about volcanoes erupting correspond to volcanic activity that occurred thousands of years in the past. Researchers have documented over a dozen Aboriginal stories that seem to preserve accurate memories of landscapes that haven't existed for more than 7,000 years. These aren't vague myths. They're geographically specific, describing bays that are now underwater, mountains that are now islands, land bridges that have long since vanished beneath the ocean. If these stories are truly that old, if they've been accurately transmitted for 10,000 years or more, then Aboriginal Australian mythology isn't just the oldest surviving mythology. It's a direct voice from the Stone Age, speaking to us across 100 centuries. The Cosmic Hunt, a global myth. Some myths appear in cultures all across the world. Cultures that had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years. Greek mythology tells this story, with the hunter Callisto transformed into a bear. Native American tribes across North America tell nearly identical stories. Siberian cultures have their version. The Basque people of Europe, isolated for thousands of years, also preserve this myth. In 2013, researcher Julien Dehuy used mathematical analysis to trace this myth backward through time. Similar to how biologists trace genetic lineages, his conclusion was shocking. The Cosmic Hunt myth likely existed before humans crossed from Asia to North America over 15,000 years ago. That means this story is at least 15,000 years old. But it was probably already ancient when those migrations happened, which means the actual origin could be 20,000, 30,000, or even 50,000 years ago. The Seven Sisters, written in the stars. Another global myth involves the Pleiades constellation, a cluster of stars visible from almost everywhere on Earth. Greek mythology tells this story with the hunter Callisto transformed into a bear. Native American tribes across North America tell nearly identical stories. Siberian cultures have their version. The Basque people of Europe, isolated for thousands of years, also preserve this myth. In 2013, researcher Julien Dehuy used mathematical analysis to trace this myth backward through time, similar to how biologists trace genetic lineages. His conclusion was shocking. The Cosmic Hunt myth likely existed before humans crossed from Asia to North America over 15,000 years ago. That means this story is at least 15,000 years old. But it was probably already ancient when those migrations happened, which means the actual origin could be 20,000, 30,000, or even 50,000 years ago. The Seven Sisters, written in the stars. Another global myth involves the Pleiades constellation, a cluster of stars visible from almost everywhere on Earth. Zoroastrianism, the forgotten influence. There's one more mythology that deserves attention, not because it's the oldest, but because it influenced everything that came after. Zoroastrianism emerged in ancient Persia, possibly around 1500 to 1000 BCE, though some scholars argue it could be even older. It was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, who taught about a cosmic battle between good and evil, between the god Ahura Mazda and the demon Angra Mainyu. This might not sound revolutionary until you realize that Zoroastrianism introduced concepts that would later appear in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The idea of heaven and hell, a final judgment day, the resurrection of the dead, a Messiah figure who would bring salvation. Linguistically, Zoroastrian texts connect to the ancient Indo-Iranian period, suggesting roots that stretch back over 3,500 years. While not the oldest mythology, Zoroastrianism represents a bridge between the ancient world, the unbroken thread. So which mythology is oldest? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we might never know. If we're talking about written records, Mesopotamian and Egyptian mythologies win, dating back 4,000 to 5,000 years. But if we're talking about actual age, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories and global myths like the Cosmic Hunt and Seven Sisters might be 10,000, 50,000, or even 100,000 years old. What we do know is this: every human culture that has ever existed has created mythology. Whether living in deserts, jungles, islands, or ice, whether isolated for millennia or connected by trade routes, humans tell stories about where we came from, why we're here, and what happens when we die. These myths aren't just ancient entertainment. They're the foundation of human